Hello, everyone. I am Aydoğan Vatandaş, the editor-in-chief of Politurco.com. Today, I have a remarkable guest, Mr. Bradley Steffens. So he is the author of the book, The First Scientist. So he wrote a book about a well-known Muslim scholar, Ibn Heysem. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
So let me start with that question. So how did the idea to write about an 11th century Muslim scholar, and how did you conclude that he was supposed to be called the first scientist?
So those are two
Yes.
separate questions,
Separate
and
questions.
unfortunately, they're both going to have a rather long answer.
Sure.
If you want me to give the thorough answer.
Absolutely.
So in 1991, I was writing a book for young adults for a series entitled The Encyclopedia of Discovery and Invention. And it was about photography. And in these books, you always started with a chapter about pre-invention technology. Then you had a chapter about the invention and then the impact of the invention and so on. In the chapter on pre-invention technology for photography, I talked about the Camera Obscura, which is an aperture that allows light into. Camera Obscura means darkened room in Italian. So this was the pre-invention technology. But what was interesting was that I read that the first person to accurately describe, that is to mathematically and physically describe the Camera Obscura, was this 11th century Islamic scholar named Ibn Heysem. What was strange was in my source, it said that he described it as part of an experiment. And this kind of threw me because I was raised to think that Galileo was the first person to actually conduct experiments. So I found that a very odd statement, but I was in the middle of working on a book, so I put in the experiment itself, and I described what he had done with the Camera Obscura, which involved having 3 lamps on a table across from an aperture, and then beyond that, a blank wall, and that he would light one of the lamps and then light the other and then extinguish one and extinguish the other, and all of this to show that light rays travel in straight lines. So he would light the one on the right, and he would observe that on the wall, the image of that light appeared on the left, and vice versa. So according to my understanding at that time, he was testing his hypothesis that light rays travel in straight lines. In fact, he was doing much more than that. What he really was testing was whether or not light rays, what we would say, interfere with each other. So he said he wondered if light rays are actually emanating from all reflective surfaces, if they're interfering, or if the lights and colors are mixing in air, is what he said. And so what this experiment was really designed to show, he was actually forcing light rays to cross at the aperture and showing that they actually were crossing at different angles. And then he observed what the effect was of extinguishing a lamp. What effect was that on the other light that was passing through the aperture? And he found that no matter what he did, the lights were not affected by putting out a light or adding a light. In other words, they weren't interfering. The lights and colors were not mixing at the aperture. So this sort of stuck with me. And many years later, about 10 years later, I suggested doing a biography for a different publisher. And I actually proposed a biography about the American poet Emily Dickinson. The publisher wanted to work with me, but they weren't so keen on the Dickinson idea. So they asked me, did I have any other ideas? And this is when sometimes no is the biggest blessing you can receive. Because if they had said yes to the Dickinson book, we wouldn't be sitting here today.
Right.
They said no.
They said no to Dickinson.
They said no to the Dickinson book.
And did they say yes to the Heysem book?
And so they asked if I had any other ideas. And I thought about Ibn Heysem for a couple of reasons. One was, I know that publishers are always looking for books about the Middle Ages because there aren't a lot of things that happened in the West during the Middle Ages. The other thing was that they're interested in books that are not about dead white males. So being a non-European and being in the Middle Ages, I knew he was a pretty good subject for biography. So I proposed it. They were interested in it. They wondered if there was enough material to actually write a biography. So I did more research, and eventually I proposed the book, and they accepted it. So that's why I wrote the book in the first place. The reason I call him the first scientist is you could go back, honestly, you could go back in history, you could go back to prehistory. If you want to look at people who tried things through trial and error to see what worked, whether it's building buildings or trying medicines or whatever, if they found an herb and they applied it to a wound and it helped, you could say that they had experimented and this was a primitive form of science. But that's not normally what we mean when we talk about science. When we talk about science, we talk about a specific methodology that involves forming an observation, forming a hypothesis, and then testing that hypothesis. And as I said before, I was taught that Galileo was the first scientist because he challenged what the Greeks had said. They had used observation and they had used hypothesis, but then they used logic and reasoning to come to a conclusion. Galileo, as said, and many experts, including Albert Einstein, Stephen Hawking, still credited Einstein as being the first scientist because he was willing to experiment, to test, rather than using pure logic, he would test to see what really happened. And this is why he was known as the first scientist. Well, there were people
What about Bacon, sir?
And before him, you had Leonardo da Vinci also did this. Roger Bacon included experimentation in his books. But 200 years before Bacon, you have Ibn Heysem, who is conducting these experiments in optics. And anyone who doubts me, that's fine. Go to the library, look at Dr. A.I. Sabra's translation of the Book of Optics into English directly from the Arabic. And it's just read it. It's full of experiments. But this is the most important.
Let me ask this, if you don't mind. So you believe that there are enough primary and the secondary sources suggesting that Ibn Heysem actually used experimental methods in his observations, in his studies, in his researches. Is that what you are saying?
Yes,
do we have enough resources?
Exactly, and especially in the Book of Optics. Now, here's what's most important, in my opinion, about the Book of Optics. I mean, obviously, what's most important is the experimentation. But it's very significant that Ibn Heysem himself realized the importance of what he was doing. Mm-hmm. In the Book of Optics, he makes a very interesting statement. He says, "We formerly composed a treatise on optics in which we often followed persuasive methods of reasoning. But when true demonstrations or experiment relating to all objects of vision occurred to us, we started afresh the composition of this book. Whoever therefore comes upon said treatise must know that it should be discarded." In other words, he knew there was a turning point in his career, in his life, where he realized that persuasive methods of reasoning that the Greeks had used, that he had used throughout his work, was no longer sufficient to establish the truth about nature and about the universe. And he said that his earlier works must be discarded, which was a very humble way of really saying all previous works that did not involve experiment must be discarded, because he recognized the significance of experiment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so, sir, are you the first writer who wrote a book suggesting or claiming that Ibn al-Haytham was the first scientist?
To my knowledge, I am, yes. I wrote the earlier version of the book in 2006. It was published in 2007 by Morgan Reynolds. And it went out of print a few years ago, and I got the rights to it. And so Blue Dome Press has brought out a beautiful, a lavishly illustrated version of the book. And I had the opportunity to expand the book. I talked more about his contributions to number theory and calculus. I talked more about his influence on Renaissance art through the Camera Obscura.
Right.
And I expand the book, it's not twice as long, but I added to it things that I've thought about over the years, especially pertaining to his, to the stories that he had feigned madness in order to escape certain responsibilities. And I went into a little more depth about that than I did in the first book. But what was funny about the first book, you have to imagine what it was like for me, because I'm sitting there, I'm not anybody. I'm just a children's author who has, found this amazing person in history, and I'm studying him, and I'm looking at the Book of Optics, and I'm thinking to myself, why hasn't anyone else written about this guy? And I did all of this research. There were no books calling him the first scientist, and there really were no essays or papers calling him the first scientist. I wonder sometimes it might be that academics were a little concerned about maybe going out on a limb and making a claim like this. And it could be that publishers were concerned about making such a claim. But me, I was just this author. So I had nothing to lose. And the facts, the research led me to the very clear understanding that he was the first scientist. Since then, so much has happened. I mean, we've had Jim Al-Khalili did his series called The Empire of Reason, and he talks about Ibn al-Haytham's contribution to modern science. He also wrote a book, the House of Wisdom, in which he also talks about Ibn al-Haytham as a trailblazer. You have the 1001 Inventions exhibit that's been going around the world, and they have a feature of Ibn al-Haytham. They have an actor playing Ibn al-Haytham. I saw it in Abu Dhabi, and they have a darkened room. They simulate a camera obscura. And now there are other books about him. So now it's pretty common to see him referred to as the first true scientist.
Sure, we are talking about an 11th century Muslim scholar. I mean, what are your sources? I mean, do we have primary sources, Arabic sources, or do we have some Latin sources, or what do you have? What kind of sources do you have?
So he supposedly wrote approximately, I've heard, about 200 books and treatises, of which 60 have survived in manuscript. Of those 60, some were translated into Latin, and a few have been translated into English. So in 1989, Dr. A.I. Sabra at Harvard University translated the Book of Optics from the oldest surviving manuscript in Arabic, which is known as the Ascari manuscript. The copyist who made the manuscript said in one of the inscriptions that he was the son-in-law of Ibn al-Haytham. Now, this could be an honorific, if you will, or he may have been the son-in-law. I happen to think he was probably the son-in-law. And one of the things that Dr. Sabra said was, it appears that he was working from Ibn al-Haytham's, and he says in an inscription, this copy is made from the author's own manuscript. There appears to be evidence that that's true, because he copied even marginalia that appears to have been written by Ibn al-Haytham rather than by the copyist. So, unfortunately, the original manuscript by Ibn al-Haytham either doesn't exist or hasn't been found. If there are any Indiana Jones scholars out there who want to find it, it would be such a gift to humankind to find the original manuscript. But this manuscript, which is in Istanbul,
Mhm.
appears to be the oldest surviving copy. And
Where
Dr. Sabra said that
Sir, where exactly in Istanbul?
I'm not sure. I looked it up once.
Topkapı Palace, maybe, or
I believe it is, yes.
Mhm.
I looked it up once because I was thinking how great it would be to see that manuscript. But Dr. Sabra said it wasn't actually complete. I mean, it's like 90% complete, but where there were missing portions, he used other manuscripts. So that's the most important. Now, there are other books that he wrote, one called Doubts on Ptolemy, which has been translated into English. There's one that's attributed to him on the configuration of the world. There's a French scholar who wrote what I thought was a convincing paper stating that he did not think that Ibn al-Haytham actually wrote on the configuration of the world. Because in Doubts on Ptolemy, he's criticizing many of the things that Ptolemy says. Mainly, he says, essentially, you're talking about points on planes and abstract thing. You're talking about the stars as if they're points on planes, but what are they? You don't tell us what they are. You don't tell us why they move. You're not telling us anything. You're just saying that they move in a certain way. And Ibn al-Haytham was very doubtful of some of the things that Ptolemy said, especially regarding retrograde motion. So the person who wrote on the configuration of the world is completely devoted to Ptolemy and his models. So this French scholar has thrown, and actually it is translated into English. I don't know, I had a feeling that it wasn't by Ibn al-Haytham myself, because Ibn al-Haytham is a rather common name. I mean,
right.
His full name was Abu Ali al-Hazan ibn al-Haytham. There are others, and so it's...
Okay. Let me ask this question, sir. So I understand why in the Western academia he wasn't given that title, to be the first scientist, maybe because he was Muslim. I don't know. But what about in the Muslim world, in the Muslim academia? Do you think that they paid enough attention to Ibn al-Haytham? Did they consider him as the first scientist? How do you see this?
Excellent question. I'm really not sure. There was a conference held in 1969 celebrating the millennium of his birth, and it was held in Islamabad, Pakistan. It had papers from around the world, and there's a proceedings that was published from that conference, and there are many different papers in there, some analyzing his work, some talking about how, what happened to the Muslim world. We were once leaders in science. Now it's the West that put a man on the moon, etc. And there was an essay in there. It was very important to me as writing the biography. It was called Ibn al-Haytham and His Philosophy, or The Philosophy of Ibn al-Haytham, by Dr. Nazir. And in that essay, he had a letter that Ibn al-Haytham wrote when he was 63 years old. He translated a letter that Ibn al-Haytham had written, and it accompanied lists of his books that he had written up to that time. And that letter talks somewhat about his life and why he had done what he had done. And this was invaluable to me. Even the translation maybe isn't the perfect translation, but it allowed me to answer why. Why did he do these things? He explains these in this letter that was written when he was 63, and I quote throughout the book. But the question is, I did see an essay. I saw one essay written, and I'm going to say it was written in the 1990s maybe, that used the words first modern scientist or something. It was by an Islamic scholar, and it escapes me at the moment. I'm not sure why he wasn't recognized in that way at that time. His books had been translated and survived in Europe in Latin. He was widely known in Europe. His books were among the very first printed books, his book of optics. So he was well known throughout Europe for many years. Eventually, of course, science progressed, and I think he just sort of dropped along the wayside. There may have been some anti-Islam involvement there, but at the time of Galileo, and I show this in my book, there was an atlas made of the moon, of the surface of the moon. And in this atlas of the moon, they had a frontispiece designed at the beginning, and it's an engraving, and it shows two scientists. It shows Galileo holding this long telescope, and the other side, there's another figure. He's wearing a turban. He has a geometric drawing in his hand, and it's Ibn Heysem. So he was considered, along with Galileo, as one of the two pillars of science up to that time. So he was widely recognized in Europe. Why he wasn't, why his story wasn't developed. But it is interesting that on the, throughout the Middle East, there are optical stores, there are pharmacies, schools, libraries, and he's even on the 10 dinar bill of the Republic of Iraq. And he was on the bill before Saddam took over. Saddam put himself on the money, but before that, Hammurabi was on the currency and Ibn Heysem. So he was widely known as an important figure. Now, it may be that a book was written in Arabic that I'm not familiar with that talked about him as the first scientist.
Okay, sir, I know that you also wrote a novel. I didn't have a chance to read your novel. I only read the one about Ibn Heysem. So can you please tell us about the plot, the story of your novel, Al-Hakim?
Absolutely. I'll tell you the story about why I wrote the novel, because I had never written fiction before.
Right.
It was probably 2008, 2009. I gave an interview to my local newspaper in San Diego, California, and the reporter, Ruth Marvin Webster, asked me after we were all done, she closed her notebook, and she said, "Do you write fiction?" And I said, "No, not really." And she says, "Gee, that's too bad, because he lived such an amazing life. It would make a great historical novel." Of course, I wanted a good interview to come out. So I said, "Oh, yes, it would make a great historical novel." And then she said, "Of course, he would have to have a love interest." And I thought to myself, here I'm trying to get Ibn Heysem accepted as the first scientist, and she's suggesting a love interest for this story. But I said, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense." The next morning when I woke up, I thought about the interview. What did I say? How did I sound? And then I remembered what she said about the love interest. And I thought, that little word, if there were a love interest, who would it be? And I went back to that inscription that I was just talking about, the inscription in the Book of Optics where the copyist says he was the son-in-law of Ibn Heysem. Well, if he was the son-in-law, then that means Ibn Heysem had a daughter, and if he had a daughter, he had a wife. But then I began to look at the dates. The date of the copy was made 40 years after Ibn Heysem's death, which would mean that if his daughter was born, for example, before Ibn Heysem went to Egypt in 1010, then she would have been in her 60s, possibly in her 70s at the time that the copy was made, and quite likely her husband would be the same age or older. But if she were born after Ibn Heysem was released, because he was under house arrest in Cairo for 10 years, if she were born after his release...
What was the reason of his house arrest?
Okay, so that's not 100% clear. There were two sources that were from his time. There were two secondary sources written within 100 years of his death, and they both said that he at some point feigned madness in order to escape certain responsibilities. One of them said he feigned madness in Basra with the governor who had appointed him to a position of responsibility. The other said that he did it in the court of Al-Hakim in Cairo, basically for the same reason, so that he could be engaged in his own research his own activities. I question both of these stories because I don't think he was the type of person that would have put on a scam like that, for one thing. And for another, it would have been quite dangerous, especially in Ibn Haytham's court, to be trying to put one over on everybody like this. But apparently, this was one of the reasons given that he was put under house arrest. In other words, he wasn't really mistreated in a sense. I mean, there are different ways you can look at this.
Right.
The other is that he had promised, or he had said in one of his treatises, that if he were in Egypt, he would be able to control the flooding of the Nile for the benefit of the people. And this is why Al-Hakim summoned him to Egypt. He surveyed the Nile. He suggested that a dam could be built near where the Aswan Dam eventually was built. But he said to Al-Hakim that he didn't think it was practical at the time. Now, some people have said that Al-Hakim imprisoned him because of his failure to produce a dam. It's unclear why he was imprisoned for 10 years. But my thesis was that for this inscription to be valid and really to make sense, that the daughter would probably be born after his release from prison. And so it occurred to me that, considering that he would have to travel back to Basra, that it was possible that perhaps that he met his wife, either after his release or possibly during his confinement. And this becomes the seed for the idea, The Prisoner of Al-Hakim, which is the title of my novel. The idea is that he actually, while he's under house arrest, he begins his experimentation and his work on the Book of Optics. The sources said he had been stripped of his books and papers. He had nothing, but he had his mind. And we know that prisoners have done amazing things when isolated, memorizing things and writing things. And so in my book, I have him beginning the initial work on the Book of Optics while under house arrest. And there's this woman, it starts out as a young woman, but bringing him food and this kind of thing. And there's a relationship that begins to develop there. And she's in a way helping him with his work. So this becomes basically the premise of the book. So it's a book about his life story, the period when he goes to Egypt. And really, I tried to incorporate as many of his actual sayings, his actual statements, especially regarding light and optics.
Mr. Bradley Stevens, thank you so much for this wonderful speech. Is there anything else that you would like to add, sir?
I just wanted to add one little statement, which is that people sometimes ask me, well, was Islam important to his career? And of course he was inspired by the Quran to seek knowledge about the universe. But I think there's something much more fundamental regarding his step forward into experimentation. And this is it. Islam teaches that human beings are flawed, deeply flawed. They're filled with error, if you will. Their observations, their logical deductions, everything about human beings is subject to error. And he talks about this in his writings. So if you really want to know the truth about the universe, what you would do is you would eliminate human beings and their opinions and their logic and try to find out from the universe itself. You would enter into a dialogue with the physical universe and let it explain to you what's happening. This, to me, was the basis of his idea for experimentation, was to eliminate human beings and their opinion, set up experiments using various apparatus, and then allow the physical universe to speak directly and to answer questions directly. And so, in my opinion, Islam was absolutely fundamental to the breakthrough of experimentation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Steffens, for this wonderful conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, today I had a remarkable guest, the author of the book titled The First scientist Ibn Heysem. So I'm really grateful to Mr. Steffens to join us today, and thank you very much for joining us. Have a wonderful day.